All right, hi everyone. So we are going to finish up the second part of the Angela Davis essay, Racism, uh, Birth Control, and Reproductive Rights. And we ended with the fact that the birth control movement, the women's liberation movement in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, got derailed or um, got sort of mixed up in, for lack of a better word, mixed up in a racist agenda, right? This movement, Davis writes on the page 354 of um, our version, had been known, right? And she's talking about the movement for abortion rights and birth control in the 60s and 70s, and it's the wariness of, um, or the sort of lack of enthusiasm of Black women to join the white women leading the women's liberation movement in the 70s. She writes, this movement had been known to advocate involuntary sterilization, a racist form of mass birth control. And so she is now beginning sort of the central point of her argument, which is about the failures of the women's movement in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, but particularly in the 1920s, after women win the right to vote and the movement for birth control in particular gets co-opted or sort of joins forces with a much more sinister movement, which is the movement for sterilization of minorities, which is explicitly a project of white supremacy. Um, and so Davis sets up this story by pointing out a general tendency in this period of history, which is urbanization, the movement from farms and rural areas to cities. And she points out what is sort of common knowledge, or this is well documented, that when women moved from their rural homes, their farms, to the city, their average birth rate plummeted. There was a large drop in the birth rate, right? So as more women moved to the cities, seeking jobs, seeking careers, they had fewer children, right? Even if you're not seeking a career or a job, even just the fact of moving to a city will mean likely that you have fewer children. Right on a farm, there is an incentive to have more children, more hands to help in the farm. In the city, on the other hand, there's an incentive to have fewer children, right? Living spaces are smaller, things are more expensive, it's more mouths to feed, and children can't be put to work in the same way. Um, so there is, in this period, already concern, fear, worry about declining birth rates uh, among white women, right? There is fear then that birth control would exacerbate or aggravate this decline in the birth rate, right? The white birth rate. And this is, taken up in the highest offices of power as a fear of losing a white majority in the United States, right? That if white women who are already having fewer babies as they move to the cities get the right to birth control, then there will be even fewer white babies. And so part of the fight against birth control, or the fight against birth control in the first decades of the 20th century, uh, did not resemble the fight against abortion rights in the 70s, right? It wasn't about uh, the right to life of a fetus. Abortion is murder. That was not the concern. Concern was about uh, demographics, right? The racial demographics of the United States, and anxiety about changing demographics, anxiety about holding on to a white majority country. I think you can we can draw our own conclusions, and I think it's worth reflecting on uh, the extent to which that idea is still um, part of the debate about abortion, right? Uh, who uh, who is it that um, the pro-life movement really wants to prevent from having abortions? Who primarily should not be allowed to have abortions? Is it, uh, you know, the poor Black women that are, who we're most concerned about, who pro-life movement is most concerned about, or is it the upper class, middle class white women who want abortions? And I think we can at least ask whether or not, in addition to the argument that a fetus is the same as a human being and has rights in the same way, a right to life, etc. We can ask if uh, there aren't additional motivations and other factors in that debate, right? So um, Davis argues, or right, makes this point based on research, that the fear in the first decade of the 20th century was that this declining birth rate among white women would result in race suicide, right? That it would be the end of the white race, white majority, white rule, uh, and that was the main argument against birth control. So she writes on 357. In 1905, President Theodore Roosevelt concluded his Lincoln Day dinner speech with the proclamation that race purity must be maintained. Nice, Roosevelt. By 1906, he blatantly equated the falling birth rate among native born whites with the impending threat of race suicide. In his State of the Union message that year, Roosevelt admonished the well-born white women who engaged in willful sterility, the one sin for which the penalty is national death, race suicide. Right. So Roosevelt, the President of the United States, is admonishing well-born white women, right, who are advocating for reproductive rights, and calling um, these reproductive rights willful sterility. And this sterility is a sin that will be punished, and the punishment will be national death and race suicide, right? The argument against birth control in 1905 was that it would lead to national death and race suicide. Now, I think it's important to note that national death and race suicide are viewed as one and the same. here, right? Or in any case, intimately linked. That uh, this sort of, preposterous idea that birth control would lead to race suicide. But the thought is, right, if the white race becomes a minority, or um, you know extinguishes itself, that will be that will lead to national death. Right? The implication being that the nation depends on white majority, on white supremacy. Right? And, life of the nation is predicated on white supremacy. I mean, it doesn't take much to read between the lines there. Um, this rhetoric of race suicide um, is echoed in our rhetoric, our discourse today, right, where we hear about white genocide, right, and the end of the white race, again, which is connected to things like the liberal agenda. The liberal agenda intends to wipe out the white race, white genocide. That's what the neo-Nazis in Charlottesville were chanting, right? Jews will not replace us. This is the fear that the white Protestant American is in decline, is a disappearing um, identity, and its anxiety about demographic shifts. So wherever you hear this idea of white genocide, or the idea that the liberal agenda is leading to this uh, you know white genocide, or anxiety about shifting demographics, uh, I think it would be wise to recall this history, right? Precisely what Davis is exhorting us to do, and what she thinks the women's movement of the 70s should have done, and would have been well served to do, right? That all that discussion is, if not explicitly racist, is part of a history that has explicitly racist roots. Uh, right? Now, the argument for race suicide, that rhetoric, failed in the 1910s and 20s, in the first decades of the 20th century. Um, and the reason why it failed was that uh, birth control became tied to uh, sterilization, an idea of sterilization, um, and that abortion would be might lead to fewer white babies, but it would also lead to fewer non-white babies, fewer black and brown babies, fewer minorities, and fewer babies being born by poor women. Right? And so the way that the argument for birth control gains traction is through arguing that birth control will um, decrease the birth rate among the poor and minorities more than it will among white women, and particularly, as Davis says, well-born white women. Uh, so the women's liberation movement sort of let uh, this racist um, application of the idea of birth control stand. And it allowed the movement for reproductive rights to sort of walk hand in hand with the argument for um, right, white supremacy, to put it bluntly. Right? Uh, and this again reinforces the idea that um, women's empowerment, the fight for reproductive rights, was always at heart uh, for um, well off white women. Um, yeah. Uh, so birth control, in a sense, became a means not of uh, liberation, but of population control, right? Precisely what the opponents of birth control feared about uh, birth control, that it would lead to decreased births of white people, um, was turned around and embraced and projected elsewhere, right? So you're worried that this is going to have an impact on the population. Well, birth control can then be used toward the racist end of controlling the populations of minority groups. She writes on 358, race suicide could be prevented by the introduction of birth control among Black people, immigrants, and the poor in general. In this way, the prosperous whites of solid Yankee stock could maintain their superior numbers within the population. Thus, the class bias and racism crept into the birth control movement when it was still in its infancy. Uh, and not only does this idea, uh, the idea that birth control would be used as um, a means of population control, uh, but it, in a sense, uh, gave a license to and worked in tandem with the active agenda to control uh, Black immigrant and poor populations. She writes, what was demanded as a right for the privileged, came to be interpreted as a duty for the poor, right? So, uh, white women, uh, wealthy white women, won the privilege to have an abortion if they chose, but it was understood as a duty to terminate a pregnancy if you were poor or a minority, right? And the primary figure that Davis analyzes here is Margaret Higgins Sanger. Right? Sanger was one of the most outspoken advocates of the women's liberation movement, of the women's rights movement. And she starts off, Davis tells us, as a true progressive. She joined the Socialist Party in 1912 and was very much engaged in um, uh, right uh, the right to abortions for all people. She famously set up uh, a health clinic in Harlem in 1921, which had an all-black board of advisors and was later, uh, worked by a black staff. And so, right, Sanger has this progressive beginning where she is imagining birth control as something that will be a benefit to all women, right? As Davis imagines that it should be, right? Something that would be a benefit to women from any kind of background, economic or racial. Uh, uh, so Sanger is this enormous figure in the women's movement, and these clinics that she started in New York, uh, one of which was in Harlem, um, were the foundation for what is now Planned Parenthood. Right, so uh, Margaret Sanger is sort of the mother of the movement for reproductive rights, and uh, had this, as Davis sees it, very promising beginning. Um, However, she writes, unfortunately, the alliance between the birth control campaign and the radical labor movement did not enjoy a long life. Sanger herself, she writes on page 360, began to underestimate the centrality of capitalist exploitation in her analysis of poverty, arguing that too many children caused workers to fall into their miserable predicament. Now, uh, what Davis is suggesting is that uh, Sanger, at some point, begins to stray from her original values and begins herself to believe that what leads to or the cause of poverty and the misery of poverty is too many children. Right, that birth control will will fix poverty, and for Davis, this is a failure of thinking. Right, that what leads to poverty is not too many children, but capitalism itself. Right, she underestimated the centrality of capitalist exploitation in her analysis of poverty. So she drifts away from these socialist roots and begins sort of trying to tailor the argument for birth control to suit a different ideology. Um, there was already uh, in this time, uh, as is well known, another movement that was underway, which is the eugenics movement, right? The eugenics movement, which is, in essence, the idea that only those with the best genes should have the right to reproduce, and those with quote unquote bad genes should be prevented from reproducing. Uh, Obviously, the eugenics movement was uh, racist in its conception. Right? What counted as, good genes would mean white genes, and the bad genes that eugenics and eugenicists believed should be eradicated were the black genes. Right? She writes, by 1919, the eugenic influence on the birth control movement was unmistakably clear. In an article published by Margaret Sanger in the American Birth Control League's journal, she defined the chief issue of birth control as more children from the fit, less from the unfit. Right? The chief issue of birth control, according to Sanger, is that we want more children from the fit and less from the unfit. Right? So birth control gets caught up in social Darwinism, right? The idea that those who strive in society, who succeed in society, are the naturally fittest. This is pseudoscientific idea. Those who strive in a society are those who are privileged by the society and the structure of society. There is nothing natural about it. So the movement for birth control becomes influenced by the eugenics movement. This is unmistakably clear. She says, um, the author of The Rising Tide of Color Against White World Superiority was allowed into its inner sanctum, the inner sanctum of the movement for birth control. This author, uh, Lothrop Stoddard, who wrote, right, The Rising Tide of Color Against White World Superiority. Right? There are plenty of racists out there today who are still, um, motivated by this fear, right, that white supremacy, global white supremacy, um, is threatened by uh, the rising tide of color, as the title of this book calls it. That is to say, by demographic shifts. Uh, so this guy, Lothrop Stoddard, was a Harvard professor and theoretician of eugenics. And he was offered a seat on the board of directors of the American Birth Control League. In the pages of the American Birth Control League's journal, articles by Guy Irving Birch of the Birch Society, director of the American Eugenics Society, began to appear. Birch advocated birth control as a weapon to prevent the American people from being replaced by alien or Negro stock. Right, so obviously, this is the racism that is, in a part of the women's movement from the beginning, and this is this history that Davis thinks advocates of reproductive rights in the 70s were not aware of. On 361, she gives a little bit more detail about this. Right? By 1932, she writes, 26 states had passed compulsory sterilization laws, and thousands of unfit, quote unquote, persons had already been surgically prevented from reproducing. Right? So by 1932, this is pretty, well, not unbelievable, but shocking. 26 states had passed compulsory sterilization laws, meaning mandatory sterilization laws to prevent those who were deemed unfit from reproducing. So birth control sort of bleeds seamlessly into the movement for the racist movement for sterilization. Continuing on 361, she writes, this episode in the birth control movement confirmed the ideological victory of the racism associated with eugenics ideas. It had been robbed of progressive potential, advocating for people of color, not the individual right to birth control, but rather the strategy of population control. Right? The reason why birth control as a right gained popularity and had influence, political influence, was because it got connected up with a strategy of population control. Now, these sterilizations didn't end in the 1930s, right? This was not a brief period. Forced sterilization is something that continued through the 70s, right? And Davis brings up a famous example of this forced sterilization, the Relf sisters. The Relf sisters, who were sterilized by a white doctor who deceived their mother about what kind of medical procedure they were going through, that her daughters were going through. Right? They were sterilized against their will, against their mother's will, uh, as an act of, um, you know, this racist doctor. She says, the Relf sisters' sterilization brought the issue to the fore, but too late to influence the politics. Had the birth control advocates learned from their own history, they might have understood why including the anti sterilization language would have helped the Black community get on board with birth control. Uh, right, so the Relf sisters, sorry, I didn't give a date on this, was in 1973. This is in the 70s, right, where this kind of deceptive and forced sterilization was happening. Right? So, beginning in the 30s, where we had 26 states with compulsory sterilization laws, through to the 70s, where Black women were still being sterilized against their will, and through deception. Um, yeah. So, how did this deception happen? Right? They had asked Mrs. Relf, who was unable to read, to put her X on a document, the contents of which were not described to her. She assumed, she said, that it authorized the continued Depo-Provera injections, a treatment that she had authorized. As she subsequently learned, she had authorized the surgical sterilization of her daughters. And so we see here also the effect of systemic discrimination, of systemic racism, right? How are you able to deceive someone into being sterilized? Well, the easiest way to do it is to, right, deprive them of an education, prevent them from having the knowledge they would need to fight back, to be informed, or even to be right, able to read a medical document. This is the same sort of thing that happened throughout the colonial age, where uh, white imperialists, white colonists would present native peoples with a document, right, written in English or Spanish or French or some language that they didn't read, tell them to sign, and then having signed, right, they would say, we now have a legal right to ownership over this land. So, um, horrible. Uh, and this kind of coercive or forced sterilization, it turned out after research and analysis, was extremely widespread. Uh, she says, Hugh funded birth control clinics in other states, as it turned out, had also subjected young girls to sterilization abuse. Right? It was widespread. On 362, she writes, under the auspices of the Eugenics Commission of North Carolina, it was learned, uh, in subsequent research, 7,685 sterilizations had been carried out since 1933. About 5,000 of the sterilized persons had been Black. Right, so 7,600 people had been sterilized against their will, either through deception or by compulsory law, right? And 5,000, the great majority of those people, were Black. And so through the 70s, birth control, abortion, birth control clinics were carrying out uh, what was essentially a eugenics program. uh, and there's a pretty incredible um, detail here, which I believe is also on 362. Uh, in 1972, in the year 1972, uh, Carl Schultz, director of Hughes Population Affairs Office, estimated that between 100,000 and 200,000 sterilizations had actually been funded that year by the federal government. 100,000 to 200,000 sterilizations had been funded by the federal government. Right? The United States government funded uh, right, as many as 200,000 sterilizations. Now, this is just in 1972. During Hitler's Germany, she writes, incidentally, 250,000 sterilizations were carried out under the Nazis' hereditary health law. And so eugenics we often associate with the Nazis. The Nazis loved eugenics, naturally, right? As a racist state, a Semitic state that was, driven by the desire to exterminate the Jewish population. One of the means of exterminating Jews was sterilization, and the Nazis, during the entire realm, reign of the Nazis from 1933 to 1945, they carried out 250,000 sterilizations. Now, Davis asks, could it be that Americans sterilized as many people in 1 year as the Nazis did in their whole reign? In 1 year, according to this research by Carl Schultz, the director of Hughes Population Affairs Office, America carried out almost as many sterilizations as the Nazis carried out over the course of their entire existence. Some more statistics that Davis cites, right? By 1976, 24% of all Native American women had been sterilized. Right? By 1970s, over 35% of all Puerto Rican women of childbearing age had been surgically sterilized. So this sterilization, needless to say, is a tool of white supremacy. And the fact that sterilization is something that was part of the program for birth control clinics, part of the reproductive rights idea. This is what Davis is pointing out, right? And so, with this history in mind, it's not difficult to understand why there would be suspicion and skepticism among the Black community, among Black women in particular, about this advocacy for birth control in the 1970s. So this is the essence of the article, right? To sort of raise awareness about these sterilization programs, which are well known in Black communities and very little known in white communities. Right? Little known because uncomfortable, because inconvenient, right? But I think Davis is pointing out, if the women's movement is ever going to be genuinely universal, it needs to reckon with this history. And right, she is specifically discussing um, the way that sterilization was discussed in the 1970s movement for birth control. Had the white leaders of that movement been sensitive to this history of sterilization, had they known about it, had they done their research, they might have understood how to frame uh, the, uh, the movement for uh, reproductive rights in a way that would be more welcoming and inclusive, and would address some of these extremely well-founded and legitimate concerns the by Black women, on the part of Black women. Now, I think by way of conclusion, um, I would say I think that this is uh, something that continues to be an issue, right? That uh, and to try and tie it in, just sort of sketchily to the other topic that was mentioned for this lecture, which is white privilege and systemic racism. That wherever there is, again, a movement that claims to be universal, right? That claims to be universally beneficial for all people. Um, it is necessary to look into the ways that these movements, in fact, affect different populations differently. Right? Any claim to universality needs rigorous analysis and rigorous critique. Um, it points to the legitimacy of the idea that there are different concerns, different valid concerns, and different issues that matter to different communities. Um, and I think in particular, it's interesting uh, that Sanger was a member of the Socialist Party, that she had these extremely progressive roots, and that she got swayed and won over by this eugenics movement, got sort of seduced into these arguments about white supremacy, and I think most, the way to probably one way to explain this might be to say that she put her own agenda, right, the agenda of reproductive rights, uh, ahead of what is good for all people, right? That she was willing to sacrifice a large portion of women who she was, purportedly defending universally in order to protect uh, rights for white women. Now, what I'm doing a bad job of um, trying to state here or express is uh, that uh, what appears to be obviously beneficial for all people to white people, uh, when it does not appear beneficial to non-white communities, um, it's likely because there is some history that white people are unaware of, and that in order to right, persuade non-white communities that some agenda or policy would be to their benefit, you need to uh, know about the issues within that community, the history of that community. And this is one reason why um, representation is so important, and why you need to have uh, members from all different communities, representatives from all different communities, discussing uh, how to make universal policies genuinely universally beneficial. So representation is one issue here. Uh, but I, you know, well, there's more I could say about this certainly, but I'm not being particularly articulate right now, and I think we've gotten our the main point of Davis's article across. So that will do it for this essay. I still want to get a video out to you guys about Robert Nozick and John Rawls, to serve as a kind of counterpoint to Marx. Uh, Rawls, who is a contractarian, and Nozick, who's a libertarian. I think it's worth acquainting ourselves with those ideas also. Um, and then I'm going to try and get this video out about environmental justice also, and think about the way that environmental justice is can be a way to sort of tie together a lot of these different ethical theories that we've discussed, a lot of the ethical topics that we've discussed. So that will do it for today. I'm going to try and get those last two videos out to you by Monday. So soon. All right, until then.